And now it's time to introduce our legislators. So today we have Representative Jeff Shipley and Representative Joe Mitchell. Thank you. And so legislators, we'll start with your opening comments. I don't know if you guys want to do a rock, paper, scissors to go first, or maybe we just start with Joe.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for being here once again this morning. Again, as I always say, it's good to hear from our constituents on the issues at hand and to get your feedback and to hear the discussions that are important to you as we move forward into the last stage of session. And obviously, things are starting to wrap up at the Capitol. I think we'll be done within the next month. And with that, we'll have budget proposals that will be coming out and be passed on the House floor, I think, in the next week or two. And I'm excited to be able to say I think we've had a very, very successful session so far. One of the main things that I've always talked on, and it's been one of my main priorities, not only this year, but for the last few years since I've served on the Ways and Means Committee, is passing the income tax bill, which we did, and the governor signed into law just a few weeks ago. And so just some highlights for you guys, and I know we'll have some additional questions after this as well, but what that bill did is make everyone in the same tax bracket, which is a 3.8% tax bracket overall for folks that aren't retired, and for folks that are retired, you'll be paying zero income tax now across the board if you're pulling from a 401k or a IPERS or cash rent. And so I think that was a very important bill that we passed, and something that I think was good to give back money that was deserved to you guys as the hardworking taxpayers of Iowa. So was proud to be a part of that process and looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you all the members of the chamber and everyone for coming out and all the sponsors that make this event possible. There's a lot going on. I just want to thank everyone for being here. As I've kind of mentioned the last couple times, we are facing a lot of really serious problems as a state and as a nation. And when I'm going to folks, I think a lot of people are asking themselves, will this be the last generation that knows what it means to be free? Because they look at how things are being taught in the school, and they look at all the mandates coming down, and the big topic is inflation, and every single day that goes by, prices are going up. And I think the most important thing as a community we need to recognize is that a lot of those problems are of a bipartisan nature. That it's easy for Republicans to take a lot of rhetoric on inflation, but when you look at the last 50, 100 years on how this problem actually came to be, it was both Republicans and Democrats selling out the people for special interest and debasing the currency. And so a lot of the major problems we have are bipartisan, and a lot of people are culpable. Same thing with our over-reliance on communist China and how the trade imbalance has gotten so severe. A lot of Republicans contributed to that. So, there's a lot of important topics we need to explore, and it's very important that we do the self-reflection to ask ourselves, how have we contributed to these problems? And I think the Republicans, by and large, are doing a great job governing Des Moines on some of these things, especially recently. I can kind of tell why some people might support the other party, just based on some of the things I've seen recently. But we have a lot of really serious problems. I think the tax bill was a great accomplishment. I think there's a lot more work to do on that. I think my personal goal is the wholesale elimination of the income tax. I think if the legislature actually cut spending, we could probably do a little bit more in cutting taxes. I think some of the criticism that some Iowans maybe didn't benefit as much as they could under the tax cut, I think those are legitimate criticisms, and again, things we need to get back and work more on. Probably the biggest thing that happened this last month, although a lot has happened this last month when you look internationally, but we did pass a bill protecting women's sports. And this was very interesting because I think most people agree, and I think we saw the NCAA championship earlier this week on how important it is that women's civil rights are protected and that women's sports remain intact. And my big concern is if the legislature isn't doing anything to affect the trans-affirming, queer-affirming curriculum that some people are trying to put in schools as young as kindergarten, as young as third grade. The radical trans activists will say that kids need to know this stuff before puberty so they can make a conscious decision on which gender they want to be. We haven't really taken any action on that, and as long as that continues to persist, you're still going to see this issue of biological males wishing to compete against women. So my biggest kind of thing, while the legislature has a lot of great intentions, we tend to do the absolute bare minimum that it takes to address any given problem at any given moment in time. And then we, like I said, we just do the bare minimum to make the angry people go away. And I think the legislature can be a lot more proactive in solving these problems. And to wrap up, I'll just mention on the mental health bills that were passed this week. So we passed some bills to subsidize more psychiatric positions and get more resident mental health care professionals in the state. But we're still not really addressing the root cause of trauma, which leads to, say, a depression or an anxiety. There's so much that we can do. There's only so much you can do on the treatment of mental health side. We really need to look a lot more on prevention and understand how these identity illnesses, these mental health illnesses are being formed to begin with. And obviously, an ounce of prevention is going to be worth more than a pound of cure. So we're always kind of cleaning up problems on the back end. We're very, very rarely ever going to the root of an issue. And I think the legislature could do a lot better job doing that. Very last, I just want to thank everyone for coming here. I'm very thankful to have this opportunity to connect with you. I do want to offer an apology for what happened last year. I was unable to participate in these events because the format I felt wasn't conducive to my health. And anyway, so I'm really thankful that we were able to find this format and work together and have these events happen. I think it's so important that we do engage in these forums and have a great discussion today. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And speaking of that format, it's time to turn to the Q&A. And so just a reminder, we do want to encourage a variety of questions here and also want to be sure that we have the time to answer as many questions as possible. So if you do have a question in mind, if you hear somebody ask a similar one, please either pivot in your mind to a different question that you had on your mind and have that question ready when your turn comes in the microphone. Secondly, just please a reminder to be respectful to our legislators and to everyone in the audience today. So after you ask your question, please refrain from interjecting or interrupting our legislators as they respond so that we may hear their thoughts and opinions in full. And then in the effort to answer as many questions as possible, provide those complete answers, if possible, I'd like our legislators to stick to like a rough timeline of 2.5 to 3 minutes per response per legislator. And then in terms of format for our Q&A, we'd like to have, if we do have any sponsors in the audience that do want to ask a question, I'd invite them to come up now and then move on to the members of the public that may have questions. And lastly, a quick reminder of the topics for the forum today. We have tax reform, House File 2317, agriculture and confinement feeding operations, House File 2305, modifying sales and use taxes, including natural resources and outdoor recreation trust fund, Senate Study Bill 3157. Medical privacy and freedom, treatment status, immunity passports, and masks, House File 2545. Student First Scholarship Proposal, House Study Bill 672. And changes to bottle recycling process, Senate File 2122. And so at this time, I do invite any of our sponsors, if they're in the audience, to come up and ask a question if they have one. And if you want to state your name, if you have any kind of organization that you're representing, as you ask your question. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Margaret Dwyer, and I'm here on behalf of the Sierra Club. And I would like the two of you to address what would you do to ensure that redemption centers, I'm speaking about the bottle bill, what would you do to ensure that redemption centers remain convenient for the public and that the centers receive sufficient financial incentive to make the collections feasible? And would you add additional types of beverage containers to the bill? Thank you.
Joe or Jeff, any thoughts?
Sure. Well, thank you, Marg, and thank you for the Sierra Club for all your help on this. So I know the bottle bill has been a contentious topic for a long period of time. My understanding is the root of the problem is the distributors, they collect all the unredeemed nickels. So they're kind of sitting on a big pile of nickels, and they don't want anyone taking their nickels away. And so, they have a vested financial incentive to make sure that this issue isn't addressed. And, a lot of people listen to them. To ensure redemption centers are adequately funded, I think there's two thoughts that I've heard at the State House. One is to completely eliminate this program. I think the idea back in the 1970s was we first instituted this to keep plastic and other beverage containers out of the roadways, out of the ditches, to keep things clean. I think there's been other ways that maybe that could be accomplished. The solution that I was personally advocating was when you look at in 1970s, a nickel back then isn't the same as a nickel today, and when you trace the cost, it'd be more like a quarter. So if we really wanted to index it to inflation over the years, you could bump it up to as much as a quarter, or even less than that, maybe a dime, and then you should have within that enough money to make sure the redemption center is viable for their operation. I think the other big thing we heard was in the market for recycled materials, China no longer was purchasing our recycled materials. They had enough trash of their own, so they didn't need to buy it from us. And just the quality of the recycled material. So I don't want the redemption center just taking the can. I want the redemption center making sure that that is a high enough quality of a material to be properly recycled. Right now that isn't happening. You can imagine how disgusting some of those things get, when people like to put their dip spit in a tin or something, and the grocery stores hate it because they don't want to deal with filthy trash. So in my opinion, it's unworkable under a nickel. Either you have to get rid of it completely, or you have to really get serious and say, we're going to make sure there's enough money to make sure the redemption centers can do this, and then also not let the distributors take any too much of an excess windfall when people aren't redeeming it. So very complicated. I don't know if there'll be any solutions this year, but we are talking about it, and certainly appreciate your input in the discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for your question. And, we're going to be releasing a proposal here very soon out of the Commerce Committee. And Representative Brian Losey, who happens to own a grocery store, will be running the current bill and proposal they came up with. So essentially, and I can't go into detail, with it, but essentially the bill that will be proposed, will say that the retailers, the distributors, and the consumer will all pay I think it's an extra half a penny. And a lot of that will go towards efforts to have more redemption centers. And the idea will be that we can have redemption centers throughout the state. And so within 20 miles of retailers and grocery stores, so then those folks won't have to necessarily handle the cans and bottles anymore. And so I know that ultimately the goal is to expand these centers throughout the state, and I know that's the goal of the current legislation that will be proposed.
20 miles seems a long way with gas prices the way they are today.
Yeah, and again, I don't think this proposal is going to be perfect, but this is something that we've been working on for the last 2 decades to fix. And I'm not completely disagreeing with Jeff's analysis either, that we either have to hike it up pretty far to make this work or to get rid of it completely, but I do know that's the current proposal that's on the table right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your question. Are there any other members of the public here that have a question today? Thank you, sir. Please state your name and any organization you may be representing.
I'm here. I'm Steve Hickenbottom. I appreciate you guys showing up today. My question to you is, there's a hazardous carbon pipeline coming through, which is the second one that looks like it's going to come through my farm. And they left it in a pretty bad situation. The little dog and pony shows that come out to show us, to have the meeting to say, how great this is, one thing or another, but they're getting to the point where they don't even answer some of the questions that we ask. I've given both you representatives, this revolving door that's going on in our state right now, and I think that maybe we have the deck stacked against us on this thing. I fought the last one, clear to condemnation. I've got about $150,000 of damage to my farm they say they're not responsible for. I don't get any callback. The first meeting I went to with Richard Lejeune, he said to call him Monday and he would take care of it, and my damages or one thing or another. I called him and he said, I got to write a letter to the governor. So it's past the buck, it's get by, nobody wants to do this. My question is I think, Joe, you voted against having us to have the power to not let eminent domain used from a private company for private property. And I I wasn't against the pipeline. I just don't think they should be able, a private company should be able to take my land, condemn it, put their pipeline in, and walk away and say, we're not responsible for that anymore. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for your question, first and foremost. And so, you know, I want to address this deal where somebody just came up here and gave me this handout with Governor Branstad on it and all of his former chiefs of staff and Governor Reynolds. So the pipeline going through our area down here in Southeast Iowa is not the Summit pipeline. It is the Navigator pipeline, which has nothing to do with any of the former governors, our current governor, or any of these lobbyists up here. And so I think it is being, it's politically convenient to be able to, you know, use those folks as kind of smoke and mirrors on what's going on with this current pipeline, the Navigator pipeline here in Southeast Iowa, and they're two completely separate companies. Now, the bill that was proposed this week, essentially said that we're going to put a moratorium on any eminent domain at all for any pipeline for the next year. And so that not only covers the carbon capture pipelines, what you're talking about with Navigator and the Summit carbon pipeline. This does not specify there is only carbon sequestration pipelines that we're putting a moratorium on. This would be any pipeline at all through the state. And so when we talk about inflation, when we talk about rising energy costs, if you're going to put a moratorium on all pipelines going through the state to not be able to use eminent domain whatsoever at all using the current rules, then you're talking about potential price hikes, even higher price hikes to heat your home, to get gas, and to make sure the energy costs are low. And so, you know, whether it's Black Hills Energy, whether it's, you know, Mid-American, whether it's Alliant Energy, they all have pipelines as well that run through folks' land to make sure that we can get natural gas to people's house, to make sure that we can get gas to the pumps through the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so what you're talking about is a very broad proposal that I think has implications that could affect each and every person here, and it was not narrow enough. And also, again, I want to restate that the pipeline that is being proposed to go through potentially your land, and I think that we need to use every single avenue possible to make sure that they're following the rules that we currently have in place. But that is not the pipeline that is being talked about up at the Capitol, and the one that we have certain folks involved in. But I do think that we need to make sure to respect landowners' rights, and we need to make sure to use eminent domain as little as possible.
Well, you talk about the energy thing and that we're going to slow it down. The information I got with the Dakota Access when they came through, that was going to be a big plus for us for our energy needs here in the United States. But if my information is correct, that oil got to a ship in St. Louis and was shipped overseas. So as far as helping our thing here, it was just a kind of a dog and pony show because it didn't happen. I mean, when the pipeline got done, gas prices and diesel fuel prices didn't go down, stayed the same. So I can't agree with you on the fact that the pipeline should have the right to take eminent domain for a private property. It's their private corporation money that they're going to gain by to come through my property and not fixing things like they're supposed to do. I mean, in my particular situation, they dug a trench through my farm, 30 feet deep, 30 feet wide, put a pipe in it. You've got topsoil, you got subsoil, you got parent material. I have parent material in my topsoil right now. I have pictures of them pushing black dirt on their haul road through my farm because they couldn't cross a bridge in my farm there. And I talked to the people with the inspector who's supposed to be working for us. They didn't do a dang thing about it. And you just get pushed off, and they just keep keep postponing you and sending you somewhere at the point where you can't keep up after a while. And they do this every day. We do it. Hopefully it was only going to be one time in my lifetime, but maybe now it's going to be twice. I don't know. But I don't think you as legislators are doing all that you could to protect the people that you're supposed to be representing. Because it looks to me like all we're doing is protecting the pipeline companies. And whether it's Summit or whether it's Navigators, this corruption looks to me like it should be addressed.
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
I do want to make sure, Jeff, I don't think you had a chance to respond to his original question, and if you had any thoughts you wanted to add or anything like that.
Joe, did you have anything you wanted to respond to that, or did you want me to go?
No, you can go first.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve, for the question. There's a lot. This is a very, very important topic. I think a lot of things that have been said that don't quite add up. So let's just make sure we're talking all about the same thing. This is a carbon capture Green New Deal pipeline. The reason this project is happening is because there's Wall Street banks at the behest of John Kerry and Joe Biden who are financing these Green New Deal projects to eliminate carbon. And it's very interesting that this pipeline is not transporting fuel. If this pipeline was transporting ethanol and getting it to market, that would be one thing. But that's not the case. And I'm still very confused. I think your point about not answering questions is very relevant because we had an update from Mr. Boyink this week in our email. I said, thank you, Mr. Boyink. Can you please explain again the purpose of this project and how the project will benefit Iowans? I can't even get an answer to that question, right? So I don't see this project in any way affecting the price of fuel. And I think there's been a lot of criticism from folks, environmentalist folks on the left that are really to the point that if you want to sequester carbon, there's probably a lot better way to do it. If one of these ethanol plants are spewing so much carbon into the atmosphere, why not dedicate a couple of acres for prairie restoration or forest or something else that can capture the carbon and put it back into the soil through the natural biology of plant life? Why are we drilling a pipeline, sending it miles to store underground when there's nature kind of can help a long way if we just maybe think about it a little bit. So I'm very confused on the purpose of the project. I was very surprised. I actually misspoke 2 months ago that carbon dioxide is a list of one of the noxious gases that does qualify as a public good. I'll be introducing an amendment to eliminate that section of code because, again, this is not fuel. This is not critical infrastructure necessary for Iowans to heat their homes. This is infrastructure for Wall Street banks, John Kerry, and Joe Biden. So I'm not interested in this project at all. I'm very much in favor of restricting eminent domain however possible. I think the biggest comment that stuck out is, they're trying to condemn this land or take this land for a lifetime of use. Why wouldn't they pay you a royalty? Right? This is your land, and they're using the force of government to take it from you. I think there's a much more fair and equitable way to handle the situation, and I think you're absolutely right. When you have Governor Branstad and Vilsack, and they're appointing the Iowa Utility Board members, when they're writing big checks to legislators, it doesn't look good. It does not look like the best interests of the people are being represented in this project. So I was very happy that delay on the eminent domain application passed through State Government Committee. I know the Van Buren County supervisors made a unanimous statement asking for something to that effect. Obviously, I think we could go a lot further to protect the property rights of Iowans, but I think there is a lot of confusion on the project, and I don't see it helping anyone. And again, I asked them, please explain the purpose of the project and how the project will benefit Iowans. I'm still waiting for an answer.
Thank you. Joe, any other comments you wanted to add?
None at this time.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
Morning, everyone. I'm David Ballou. I live here in Fairfield. I've been asked by Diane Rosenberg to ask her question, which she is not able to be here to ask. She says, Iowa has 751 polluted waterways according to the latest DNR impaired water list. It's not getting any better. The DNR also reports that 92% of nitrogen and 80% of phosphorus pollution comes from agricultural sources. Iowa's pollutants contribute to the dead zone, now the size of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined. High nitrate levels are also unhealthy for human consumption, and 1/3 of all Iowa's municipal water utilities are at risk for nitrate pollution. Iowa's dirty waters also threaten the driftless area's multi-million-dollar fishing and tourism industry. Given this tip of the iceberg of the harm our agricultural practices impose on Iowa, and given 63% of surveyed Iowans support a factory farm moratorium, Representatives Mitchell and Shipley, what will it take for you to finally support HF 2305, calling for a factory farm moratorium when it is reintroduced next year? And then she adds for Senator Dickey, who's the senator, when the Senate version is introduced next year, Senator Dickey, will you support this bill? Why or why not?
Thank you, Dave. So I talked with Diane Rosenberg probably about 3 weeks ago about this, and it was a fairly long conversation. I'd say, and I do live about a quarter mile from an animal husbandry operation, and I talked to the owner, and a couple times over the summer there is an odor issue, not something that's too overwhelming or affects me inside the house, but little things. And so I try to communicate that with operators. I think the biggest thing that I'm concerned with when we look at animal husbandry and livestock is the trade imbalance with China. And I guess that's what I'm most concerned about, is if we're just raising animal protein and shipping it to the communists, and then they get to eat all this delicious bacon, and then we're stuck with the pollution, I don't necessarily think that's a great deal. But I would say, I think one of the big things that we learned, at least I learned through the pandemic, is just how important having access to food is, and protein really being an analogy for the strength of a nation. There's a lot of underdeveloped countries out there that they just don't have access to as much macronutrients, and pound for pound animal product is going to be more nutritious than other products. So I think there is a lot of work we can do on the water quality angle of things. That's something I was trying to learn a lot about back in 2019 and find solutions for. We kind of got sidetracked during the pandemic. So I'm very interested in those issues. I don't believe a moratorium will be a right solution. I think there's probably other ways you could do it if you wanted to carve out and do it watershed by watershed. But I'm just not sure that setting the moratorium is perhaps the right signal, although I think there is a lot of conversation we need to have. I think it's been almost 25 years now since they did initially write these regulations governing the siting of hog confinements. I think once in a generation, you probably should open the books again and see, is this serving Iowans? We have had rapid expansion of the industry over the last 2 decades under those present rules. So as the industry continues to grow, and as Iowa remains the same size, obviously where these confinements, where these operations go, is going to be a more pressing issue. Obviously, I think one solution is you could inject some semblance of local control into the discussion, but obviously it's going to be a very difficult issue, and I'm not exactly sure how we should best address it. I'll just end with that.
Well, I'll jump in as myself here for a second. So to me, a major component of the problem is the pollution, and I haven't heard you talk about that at all.
Well, on the pollution side, I know the city of Fairfield is still trying to get our wastewater plant in order, and human beings tend to pollute quite a bit. The best mechanism, maybe we need to expand the offsets to keep them an extra 500 feet away from waterways. Maybe we need to look at the manure management plans and buff those up somehow. I'm certainly not an expert on the subject. I would be very interested. I remember back in 2020 when I did sign on to this proposal, I had a lot of interesting conversations with folks in industry and their best practices. The water pollution is one thing. I know even just maybe you add something on the matrix to score that, hey, you have to plant trees and surround. That's been a pretty popular, just install a tree buffer, and that'll help maybe keep some of that contaminant pollution in place. So I think there are room for improvements. I think we need to all come together and really squarely address the issue. I think there is a lot of gaps in water quality and how exactly we collect and analyze data. That is a big problem. I would say, the health of water definitely reflects the health of us as people. So it is extraordinarily serious. It's also going to be very politically contentious. And we know, speaking about the industry groups that are pushing the pipeline down our throat, obviously the big pork producers and international corporations like Smithfield are very powerful as well. So you're going to be hitting special interest, pretty hard. And we have to find a way to at least broach that conversation. If there's an issue there, we need to explore it. We need to document it. I guess one of my biggest frustrations when talking to the industry is they will try to deny kind of source point pollution. They'll say, oh no, that was, Lake Darling got shut down because there's too many geese. I don't think anyone's really buying that explanation. So, I think we just need to be as honest as possible, collect data, and really get clear in what the problem is with some measurement. Sorry if that's not the best answer for you, but I don't know what else I can really do at this time.
Thank you. Joe, any comments?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. So, on the topic of private property rights, I think it's funny if we're going to talk about, the pipelines, but then not talk about how a moratorium is also an infringement on private property rights, not being able to put up a hog shed or turkey shed on your land for your own business. And so, I will never sign on to a moratorium. to be able to stop someone from building, a hog shed or turkey shed on their own land to be able to, provide for their family and start that business. I do think, though, that the legislature has went to efforts to be able to help with water quality. The last few years, I know we've put millions of dollars towards water quality. We're talking about terraces, we're talking about cover crop initiatives to be able to, stop pollution specifically from pesticides and fertilizer that run into our streams. And I do think that, there's a debate to have on what is actually causing a lot of the, the pollution and water quality problems in our state. I think a lot of those do happen to have come from, the chemicals that we put on our field. And I think that's why we've encouraged, as a state, folks to be able to do cover crops and put terraces up and, be able to essentially encourage folks to do better practices when they're planting crops.
Well, Joe, I would agree with you if the pollution of these CAFOs were confined just to my property and I was just polluting my own property. But when it goes to the neighbors and the surrounding community, I think we have to protect them.
Well, then just to that point, another reason why I don't think it's as simple as private property is because you'll see a facility is built and then immediately the value on a neighboring home is reduced. So there is an immediate impact aside from just the pollution that when a new facility comes up, it does necessarily affect the entire neighborhood. So yeah, private property is sacrosanct and very, very important, but we must be very, very conscious how our actions, how our industry affect our neighbors. And again, that's just, I guess, a symptom of the world right now, that we're all kind of just ignorantly spewing our filth all over, politicians especially. So yeah, thank you for the question, Dave.
Thank you so much, Dave. Joe, did you have any other comments on that?
No.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for coming and hosting and being in this event. I was just wondering if you could. I was going to let this go, and then. Oh, by the way, my name is Kelly Scott. I'm a longtime educator and a part of the Fairfield School Board. I was just going to let it go, and then Mr. Shipley, in your introduction, you mentioned about things that are being taught in our schools. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming, and I guess it's bad to assume, that one of those things you're talking about is the CRT thing. And then I'm going to come back to the bill that we're actually talking about here. I got a second question, but I just don't want to be in anybody's way. So I guess my question then is if you've come out against it and teachers are getting lambasted and school districts are getting lambasted about teaching this, can either of you actually define it and tell us exactly what that looks like in a classroom? Because I'm a guy that's in a classroom every day. And second of all, just because to illustrate how big of an issue this is, I have throughout, since I am an educator, and I've been approached by parents and I've been approached by my own colleagues at the school I work at, since August when the bill came in July, I've put together some things here in order to give my people. It's not for you guys or anything else, but if you'd like a copy, I would give it to you. Or anybody else. I have about 7 or 8 as to actually what CRT is and what it is not. And last forum I watched, somebody came up and was upset about Reconstruction being taught, and it was just kind of let go. So I guess my question then is, if you're going to hold us accountable for it, can you please explain or define what it is you're against, what CRT looks like, and what it is actually defined as, without looking it up online?
All right. John,
All right.
thoughts?
Well, thank you, Kelly. No, I was just pulling up the bill, and you're right. The definition of what critical race theory is a source of contention. We'll hear educators say, "Oh, we don't teach critical race theory." So, okay, why are you so opposed to a ban on it then? But no, specifically, so House File 802 passed out last year outlined 10 specific concepts as divisive concepts. I think the two that stand out is that that the United States of America and the state of Iowa are fundamentally or systematically racist or sexist, that an individual solely because the individual's race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so the text you've been using in your 8th grade class by Ibram X. Kendi, who's one of the most prominent race theorists in the nation, he is in favor of discrimination. He definitely discriminates between white and black people. He has this theme that white people are inherently racist, and the only way to account for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only way to account for present discrimination is future discrimination. So yes, you are using a book in your 8th grade class by one of the most foremost racist critical theorists in the nation, who says that white people, whether consciously or unconsciously, are racist. And so I would kind of pose the question back to you, that you by being a light-skinned person, do you feel that you are consciously or unconsciously racist?
No, I do not. However, as a teacher, and following the Iowa Code, and plus on the back and within this packet that I've created for my people, I have the social studies standards for 8th grade and for high school. And within that, you're supposed to compare different viewpoints. I can't find, and again, this is where things of that nature by Kendi are a differing viewpoint. When you compare that, I mean, is there actually teaching of that doctrine going on, or is it being used as a viewpoint? And I guess my question is, if you're not in the classroom and you're only hearing it from parents who, and I believe it's only just a couple, that are upset about this, that don't understand what it actually is, teaching of Reconstruction and other things like that is bad. It's not.
Well, so let me, and you're right, I think we need to have as many viewpoints as possible, and American history is rich and it's deep, and we need to have as much knowledge of history as possible. When I was voting against education funding in 2019, it was precisely because students were not being equipped with U.S. history or civic engagement. But to your point, I do want to just caution you, because we say, well, it's only a couple of parents, and they don't know what they're talking about. That comes off as extraordinarily condescending. And every single parent, every single child, we have a responsibility for as a state. And I think you're absolutely right that it would be possible to introduce these concepts in a way that does not violate the law. That's why some legislators wanted to put cameras in the classrooms, or at least have access to recordings to spot check this sort of thing. Certainly the complaint we've heard from parents is so much of the coursework has gone online that it becomes a lot more difficult for a parent to oversee what's happening. But no, again, to the definition of critical race theory being that systemic racism invented by white people is a fundamental organizing force of Western civilization, I think that's outwardly false, and I think the academics who promote that are so far in left field and so far in their own Marxist mental illness that they do not belong near children. And you're right, there could be different interpretations of the law. I would encourage your school district to just avoid the text completely to make sure these issues don't arise.
I understand, and I couldn't agree more with what you just said there at the very end.
Well, thank you.
And being, indoctrinating or whatever. But again, it's a situation where using something as a provocative counterpoint does not make it teaching of that subject. And I'm just, in order for us not to get into a debate, because I want to be careful with everybody else's time, and Mr. Mitchell hasn't talked about it as well, I would...
No, and I appreciate this. Actually, I love the conversation, because I told this to my colleagues too. If it's just an open-ended essay question that says agree or degree and explain why or why not, and you're just graded solely on your ability to write and critical reason, that's totally acceptable. I think that's one of the reasons I was very interested in getting an invitation to your junior, senior government classes and being able to hear from them what's actually happening in the classroom. I've not ever received any correspondence from the district, so just from my perspective, and again, Kelly, I really appreciate your vote to keep kids in school and all the wonderful things you've done in the district over many, many years. But there just seems to be this kind of barrier. And just myself as a lawmaker, when educators say, no, don't come to our classroom, we don't want you talking to our kids, it does make lawmakers feel like you guys are hiding something or something like that. So the more openness and transparency, the more that we can invite parents to get involved, even if it is only 1 or 2 or 3 complaints, those complaints are valid and we need to treat them, with as much respect as possible. So your question's great. It's very timely, and these are ongoing discussions in the State House. So I would love to follow up and learn more, because I think you make a really, really great point.
Well, I appreciate that, sir, and thank you. Mr. Mitchell, please respond, and then I have a offer back.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks, Kelly, for the question. I would concur with some of the points Jeff's made. I don't agree with critical race theory either being taught in our schools, to our children, but I do think we can have differing viewpoints, and that's what education should be about, and that's what our kids should be able to learn about, thinking critically, but not on the basis of critical race theory, which I think is ultimately racist as well. I do think a lot of these issues need to be taken care of at the local level, from the local school board, from talking to members of your guys' school board, from talking to Superintendent Knoll. It sounds like you guys have been trying to take care of some of these issues internally. It also sounds like this teacher may be on leave as of right now. So I think that you guys have been taking appropriate steps to be able to address this issue, and I hope that is all true. But I think the other thing is too, I want to address is, again, we hear about these specific examples of teachers here and there maybe teaching this, which I think ultimately should be taken care of at the local level and should be absolutely addressed. But then that I feel like overall the education profession is getting a really bad name because of these one specific instances, and I just wanted to make sure that educators know that, again, and I've stated this before, the very vast majority of educators, whether they're in private schools or public schools, are doing a phenomenal job in teaching our children, and they should feel like they need to be appreciated. And for me personally, talking to teachers specifically in this community, they don't feel like they're appreciated. And I feel like some of that comes from proposals that came from the legislature, where we can prosecute them for certain things that maybe we can't, prove that they did. I think the cameras in the classroom, feels like that, they aren't appreciated. And when I come to Fairfield Community Schools and we have teachers that are long-term subs that have been there for 8 months teaching first grade, that's not good. And that's not good because there's a shortage overall in workforce, but there's definitely a shortage in education. And that's not where we want the shortage at, because we want our kids to be educated. And I think that folks that are teaching things that are wrong should be held accountable. And I think our local school boards should keep them accountable. But at the same time, I think the other 99% of teachers that are doing a great job need to be thanked.
Thank you for those thoughts. And I just want to extend to you, even though I don't teach in this district, I'm on the school board here. I would welcome you to come into my classroom in Ottumwa, where you see a very diverse clientele versus what we have here in Fairfield, and watch what's going on in the classroom. And I'm okay with that. I don't have anything to hide. I don't teach critical race theory. None of my colleagues do. And I just want to be clear that just by using a provocative subject or a provocative text is not the teaching of critical race theory. It's divisive, to say the least, but it's not teaching of critical race theory. And I just wanted to back away, and I would welcome to give you this packet if you guys want to see me afterwards, but I just don't want to take any more time. And then I'm going to circle back around and talk about the specific bill that actually is on the agenda. All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Hello again, Marg.
Hi, I'm back. Boy, I don't know where to start here. I have kind of a complicated question, starting with Bill 3157, which is the modifying sales and use tax, including the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund, or IWIL. I have a concern that this bill is going to completely change what voters approved in, what was it, 93, 60, whatever, when we approved the 3/8 cent sales tax. And there were specific things outlined in that bill as to how that money was to be distributed and used. And including this in this modifying sales and use taxes bill breaks the agreements that were made in 2010. So I guess my first question is, would you remove the trust fund from this bill because it's going to use it for other things? Now I realize the other things you want to use it for are good things to use it for, but it's not. We can't. I don't like to set up the dichotomy that we can have one or the other. I think we can have both. So I'd ask you to remove this from the trust fund bill and go forward with funding the I-Will as it was originally approved by the voters. My second question, and it's related to that, is it feels to me like the legislature has been very aggressive this past session in protecting what it defines as individual freedoms. And we have the medical privacy and freedom bill and other things that we've discussed. And I wonder, what is your position on the preservation of the common, or the things that we all share, like rivers and public universities and clean drinking water and public health, bridges, all that kind of stuff. I don't see so much attention to that. And again, I don't like us to say, well, we can have one or we can have the other. We can have economic development or we can take care of the common. I don't believe that we have to choose. I think we can have both. And I find it distressing when we have so much of a surplus that rather than take care of some of the things that we have not been able to take care of in the past, we're giving the money back. I find that puzzling, and I'm sure other people find it puzzling. And I feel like the DNR is showing up that it hasn't been able to maintain its facilities or take care of its locations. And we all learned during the pandemic that we really need the outdoors bad. And it's very important for our health. And so that's my question. How do we manage to take care of both the common and personal freedoms? And would you remove the I-Will from Senate Study Bill 3157?
Gentlemen, comments?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question again, and I haven't looked at that specific Senate file that you're addressing. I know in the past I've been in favor of I-Will. I think that we should respect, the voters' choice, which is, they wanted to put in that recreational trust fund, and it has not been funded yet, of course. And so I do believe that we should, respect those wishes of the voters. And, obviously we had the governor's bill proposed just a few years ago to be able to fund I-Will and also cut income taxes. And, again, my philosophy is I don't think that folks should have to pay income tax, but I do think that obviously we need to fund the state some way. And I think the best way to do that is through consumption taxes and sales taxes. And I think when those are raised, we do need to, be able to, make that promise kept, and which is meaning funding I-Will. And so, I haven't seen the specific Senate file, that you're talking about, but I have historically supported funding that recreational trust fund, which the voters asked for back in 2010.
Thanks, Mark. Great to hear from you again. Great question. The I-Will vote was a long time ago. A lot's changed by then. It probably would be a good idea to bring it before the people again for another vote. One thing you said we've been aggressively defending freedom. I don't think we've actually been doing that. I think that's probably more of a perception that some people have been putting on. Again, I think more often than not, we do the absolute bare minimum that it takes to get the angry crowds to go away. Really, I think when we're talking about the environment and their interaction, it's really just an alignment of values. What do people value most, and what do we individually value? And a lot of us have made sacrifices in trade where, we value money more than our personal sovereignty, and therefore that's why we've gotten all these corrupt business deals with China. We've sacrificed so much over the years, and we're really losing sight about what's most important. And I think the great outdoors, even precisely, is a great point. I called it a public health priority, that we need to be able to, kayak down these creeks and everything, and make sure we have, our state parks are adequately maintained. So there are a lot of issues here. I think in general, we want to eliminate taxes. I think that's the goal a lot of people have put forth. When we look at sales tax revenue, again, I think it's very, very important that we continue to look at these things on an ongoing basis. I said maybe, for the siting regulations for animal husbandry, we should probably look at those every 20 years. For sales tax revenue, probably every 5 years. And when we look at the save sales tax penny, I think I mentioned this a couple months ago, we have a penny dedicated to school infrastructure that was passed a long time ago and then extended, but in that meantime, the definition of school infrastructure has changed so dramatically. So, the policies, the world is changing so fast, and the policies rarely ever keep up. So that would be kind of my approach, is making sure that we are taking a fresh look at all of these issues as often as possible, and that rarely happens, if ever.
My follow-up question is, both of you now have said that you'd like to see income tax go to zero. And that also alarms me a great deal, because that means we're going to have a lot of sales tax, because we do have to fund the government. And I can imagine a future conversation where we're going to say, well, we can't raise the sales tax anymore because in Illinois it's lower, or in Nebraska it's lower, and we won't be competitive. So that concerns me. And I personally, knock me down, but I don't mind paying some taxes. I feel like I like using roads. I like having public health. I like to have the amenities that we enjoy in our country. So I'm concerned that if and when sales income tax goes to zero, that is not going to be sufficient to give us the quality of life that we want. But that's not a question. So
I think a lot of people would share those concerns. I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. There's a lot of things that can be accomplished voluntarily without taxes. And when we're looking at what really provides the services that we enjoy, a lot of that's delivered at the local and county level. So for instance, when I'm talking about eliminating taxes, in my mind, I'm talking about also reducing the size and scope of government, or making sure the government is only making investments that actually pay a decent return. And so, like in my mind, the best money the state of Iowa spends is on the community colleges, where we're equipping young people with career skills and trades early on. That I'll fund all day. But when we talk about some of these other priorities, it's sometimes very difficult to understand how some of this pork barrel funding, really helps the lives of Iowans. So I think if we're spending money effectively, and I think if we're kind of shrinking the overall size and scope of government, like for instance, the Iowa Department of Education is very redundant with the area education agencies. So is it possible that we could wholesale eliminate entire departments and actually put the government power to the people back closer locally in a way that it might be more responsive or more specially tailored to that local environment? And so I think there's a lot of really, really important things we need to look at when we just look at the way state government is set up and how we could be doing a better job across the board.
thank you.
Joe, do you have any additional comments?
Yeah, and I just have to add to that as well. I mean, so, if you look at historically, we've reduced income tax rates by about half in the last 4 or 5 years. And so throughout that time, you've still seen exponential growth in the state budget. And so, when you look at states like Florida and Texas and now South Dakota, this is our neighbor, who have now zeroed out their income tax as well, they've also not seen a dramatic decrease actually at all in their state revenues, and they've actually seen an increase from businesses and folks coming into the states and spending more and having more folks there to pay more, property taxes and different fees and sales taxes and those sorts of things. So I think, you had to do it in a responsible manner. Which I think we've gradually done. We didn't go from 8% at the top tax rate down to zero right away for a reason. Mm-hmm. And what you've seen, what the state is, we've overtaxed folks, and that's why we have $1 billion surplus. That's where that comes from. And so we know that we're going to continue to overtax folks, and so we can continue to drop those rates to give people back their own money and also be competitive with neighboring states.
I appreciate that, but I still puzzle over, we have this surplus, and yet we have a mess in Medicaid and a mess in the DNR. And if there's so much money, I don't understand why we aren't funding the things that need to be funded. That's just, I'm puzzled, and you probably aren't going to be able to answer that quickly, but that's my question. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate it. And again, when you're talking about Medicaid dollars, even a lot of dollars that are tied to the DNR, a lot of those are tied to federal matches as well. And so, we expect the federal government to come in and pay their fair share. And a lot of times they don't. And so, I get there is still, funding challenges, but at the same time, I do think there's a balance you have to have between giving taxpayers their money back that they deserve and also be able to, fund our essential needs that I think Iowa does, by and large, a good part of doing.
I do just want to touch on that Medicaid piece since you brought it up, because Medicaid is the second largest driver of the state's budget, and it's incredibly costly. And really, when you look at what's driving that increase, is we have an aging population, and we have a population that is getting a lot more chronically ill and needing a lot more health care. So those are very serious problems that the government maybe didn't necessarily cause, but those are big problems, and we all need to kind of ask ourselves what we can do to help contribute that to ease up the system, because when you have something as big as a population demographic issue, no matter how much money the state of Iowa spends, you're not going to fix it. So there's a lot I could talk also on just what we're seeing with chronic diseases, and when I visit some of the adult in-home care facilities and what they're facing, and just again how these problems came to be, a lot of them, when the government tries to solve them, it's just the government is not capable of providing a solution.
That's all true, Jeff, but it's also true that privatization was a bad mistake, and no one's done anything to fix it.
There was a lot of bumps of road in the privatization. Obviously, that decision was made before I came in there, and I voted for Democrat amendments to make sure we're auditing those private contractors. Those private Medicaid contractors are also the ones that have been violating people's medical freedom, so I'm very much wanting to put as much oversight on those folks as possible. But that's just unfortunately the socialized medicine system that we have, that the health insurance companies are going to ration care, and they're not going to care about the patient. You're just a number on their database, and they're going to check a box based on what insurance is going to pay for, and it's not health care. That's not a doctor-patient relationship. That's a corporate, socialized medical system that doesn't care about it doesn't care about people. So that's what we have, and yes, we need to fix it.
Thank you both for your comments, and thank you, Mark, for your question.
Hi, I'm Tom O'Donnell from Keosauqua. And Representative Shipley, I'm confused. I was at the forum, I believe, in January, and the pipeline came up then. And at that point, you also said, well, this is a consequence of Joe Biden, John Kerry, and the Green New Deal. That didn't make sense to me at the time because this was January 2022. Biden had been in office only about a year. The pipeline plans had come out in fall and summer of 2021, which is only a few months after Biden came into office. There's no way that they could have drawn up these plans and arranged the corporate financing and everything in just a few months. So I looked it up. And the driver of these plans is the expansion of 45Q federal tax credits, which was part of the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act, passed in a bipartisan way, and signed by Donald Trump in 2018. That expanded the 45Q credits. So that didn't make sense. It made no sense that it was Joe Biden, John Kerry, and the Green New Deal driving this when it was something that was passed in 2018, 2 years before Joe Biden came into office. So after that meeting, I sent you an email, and I pointed this out and said, it's really not Joe Biden, John Kerry, and the Green New Deal, which are great buzzwords and gets people angry. It was the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, which Donald Trump signed, Republicans voted for. And you replied to me in that email, I don't claim to know what I'm talking about. And I said, great, give him a pass, he didn't know about this. And then you said it again today, that it was Joe Biden, John Kerry, and the Green New Deal, when that is impossible.
So what I'm specifically referencing is the financial component of the project. So this is a $3 billion proposal that does not have any clear return on investment outside of that tax credit scheme. So what motivated the Wall Street banks to fund a project that has no clear return on investment? It was due to the carbon conference they had last year, And there was a big article written in Time magazine about this, about John Kerry's the great diplomat because he convinced the Wall Street banks to fund these projects. So I'd be happy to follow up with that article. And you're right, I opened my comments saying that a lot of these serious issues, such as the Green New Dealing of America, is bipartisan. And yeah, it has been a long bipartisan record of people selling out our freedom and selling us out to these globalist schemes such as carbon cap and trade. So I stand by my remarks, and I'd be happy to share that article detailing how it was John Kerry, and they all gave him a big pat on the back because he convinced the Wall Street banks, I think a total of $7 trillion over the next several years, to finance projects like these, where there is no economic value for storing carbon under the ground. That is not giving anyone a greater return on investment. It's just so they can sell ethanol and say it's a more environmentally friendly or more carbon neutral product. So I stand by my remarks, and I'm happy to continue that email thread, but that's where I'm coming from.
Well, let's be clear. I'm agnostic on the carbon pipeline. I'm not necessarily a fan. I do tend to agree that it is designed to make a lot of money for a few people. But to say that this law that was passed in 2018, that is clearly the driver of this, is somehow the result of the Biden administration, it just doesn't add up.
There's no, okay, when a bank is issuing a loan, they want to make sure the loan is repaid, and there's no financial return on this pipeline project. So to get a bank to commit $3 billion for a pipeline that's just going to sit there and store carbon underground, that was because there's a huge political push in this carbon neutral and this offset, and so the financing, yes, the tax credit piece from 2018 is a very important piece. The actual financing that got banks agreeing to do this.
And they did that in 6 months. We had companies last summer coming out with full-fledged plans for where these pipelines were going to go, who their customers were going to be, how they were going to pay for it. That all came together in the span between January and June, July of 2021. That's what you're telling me?
I can share with you the article that praises John Kerry and the Wall Street banks for agreeing to finance these things, but again, a $3 billion project.
Was this a news article, or was this an opinion?
This was Time magazine. So I'm happy to share with you everything that I read, but the fact remains is that this project's being financed. It's not really clear, again, I asked what's the benefit of the project. I still don't have an answer to that. So I'd imagine, what is causing a bank to issue a $3 billion note on an infrastructure that's just going to store carbon underground?
They wouldn't be doing it if they weren't getting paid, and they are getting paid. They're getting
that's what I'm saying. Is the government is put so much pressure. There's so much pressure to go to this Green New Deal agenda because we've been propagandized for 20 years now that carbon is killing the planet.
Well, and it is. Let's be clear about that.
Well, so then
Shipley.
Thank you guys so much for this lively debate. But it is turning into a debate, and I do want to make sure that we honor our other individuals that are waiting to ask questions. I think, Joe, did you have a couple quick comments?
Yeah, if I could just chime in here as well. I do think that reducing carbon emissions has been a bipartisan effort, and I think it should be, and that's why you talked about that bill was signed in 2018 bipartisanly by President Donald J. Trump. But again, I want to talk about the benefit, to the pipeline, because I think, Jeff, you stated you still know what it is. I think when we're seeing a continued increasing push for electric vehicles. And if we continue to see a push for electrical vehicles, then ethanol will no longer be a sustainable option if we're trying to get to zero emissions. And so what this pipeline does is it essentially zeroes out carbon emissions for ethanol, so we can continue to use ethanol, which a vast majority or a lot of our corn production goes towards ethanol. If we no longer have gas-powered vehicles that use ethanol that we can say are carbon neutral, well, we're going to be in a world of hurt here in Iowa where we make a lot of corn. And so that is the reason for the pipeline, is to make sure that our ethanol plants are carbon neutral to continue to compete with continuing electrical vehicles, which also Elon Musk gets a lot of federal tax credits. So it's not just our pipeline here in Iowa that are going to get a lot of tax credits. It's also a lot of electric vehicles that also get tax credits for being carbon neutral and having zero carbon emissions. So that's the benefit that it brings to our state to make sure that we can continue to have a flourishing ethanol industry, which ultimately helps not only Iowans, but also our farmers and our agriculture industry as a whole.
Thank you so much, Joe and Jeff, for your comments, and thank you, Tom, for your question. Next question, please.
Hey guys, thanks for being here. My name's Ed Hipp. I'm from Fairfield. I want to ask you guys to address, maybe in a kind of an essay form, the whole issue of medical freedom, or freedom as it's known sometime, the particular aspect of it that we call medical freedom. And in this case, there's some legislation around medical freedom and privacy. So to set up your answer, I would say it appears to me that of all the government structures that we see, from the federal government to the various state governments, you could rank all these governments on a kind of 0 to 10 scale for how prioritized they are for freedom versus whatever else they might put in front of freedom. So, like we've got probably Florida is the 10, where they made a very strong commitment to medical freedom for people. And some people would say, well, that's all, they're going to take a hit. But many of the things I see, it doesn't seem like they're taking a hit. They're doing just as well on the things we would give up medical freedom for as places that are completely sacrificing medical freedom for what they think will cause health. So I would like to have you guys talk about where you see Iowa on this 0 to 10 scale now, where you see us going, who's the leaders in this, in the various governments, and who's the leaders in our government, in our legislature. How do you see yourself as a leader in this, or not a leader in this? You're prioritizing the other things over freedom. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ed, for your question. And happy to discuss this issue, because just this last week we had a proposal that came to the Iowa House floor to expand dramatically our medical freedom for employees all over the state. And unfortunately, it was voted down. And so I proudly voted for that piece of legislation. And essentially what that piece of legislation said is that, there cannot be vaccine passports at all. You cannot ask people for their vaccinated status at all if you're an employee with any employer here in the state. The one thing it did have that every other state that has passed medical freedom also had is that if there's a federal mandate that those folks have to have vaccination, that was a carve out. And that was a carve out because if you don't have that in there, then you wouldn't see Medicaid dollars, Medicare dollars coming to this state, which is just, that just isn't something that is even possible to be able to run the state if you don't have the Medicaid and Medicare dollars from the federal government coming here. And the problem is that the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government is justified to be able to hold back those Medicaid and Medicare dollars, if folks aren't vaccinated. But what we had was a proposal, was one of the most largest and impactful medical freedom proposals in the United States that we've seen thus far, and unfortunately, it was voted down. And so, again, I was happy to support that proposal, because even though it wasn't perfect, because I don't think you can have a perfect medical freedom proposal with the way the Supreme Court has ruled, but it did move the ball a long ways. And so it was sad to see that bill, voted down on the floor. We'll continue to fight to try to expand medical freedom in the state, which I think we absolutely need to.
Thank you, Ed, for the question. Joe, real quick, did you read that Supreme Court ruling on the CMS?
Did I read it like line by line, or just?
Yes, did you read it?
I mean, I didn't read the whole case, no.
All right. So there's a few things you said there that aren't quite right, and I think that's part of the problem is legislators don't read. And even when we were debating on that medical freedom in caucus, I said, hey, the bill manager, did you read the CMS mandate? No, they hadn't read it either. So medical freedom and freedom is the foundational topic, right? Because if a government can violate your personal space and force a medical treatment on you, you're not a free human being. And that's what we've seen. And that's been the difficulty, where there's been so many people who's had to make a very difficult decision because the government is asking them to violate their conscience. And So there's a lot of work to do on medical freedom. We passed the exemption bill in October. Unfortunately, that did not prove to work very well. You still had a large number of nurses be fired after that. And that's very unfortunate that healthcare workers are being denied employment. My biggest thing is right now there already is a code section, 216, that is supposed to adjudicate unfair discrimination. And that's the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Commissioner, and that's not happening. And so we had a big bill that addresses quote unquote unfair discrimination, except when a healthcare facility does it or except when the federal government does it. And we're just already ignoring what already exists in law and what should be working, because there have been a lot of complaints filed. For instance, I know there were religious liberty complaints filed against our school district, filed against the Maharishi University, that still remain unresolved. And the Civil Rights Commission does have the power for temporary injunction that if they determine unfair discrimination is occurring, they can step in and stop that. That hasn't happened yet. So I'm very interested in that process. Medical freedom is going to be a defining topic for a long, long time, because these issues are not going away. Even in the jurisdictions that pulled back on their vaccine passport bills, they are said so, that, hey, the precedent is set and this could come back at any time. So people are already being trained to, obey and comply and allow the government into literally a pharmaceutical product that affects the functioning of their cells, right, at a very, very sacred level. So what the Supreme Court ruling said is it said the CMS had a statutory authority to implement the emergency rule. The Supreme Court did not make any such ruling on how that would affect a state who had a law to the contrary, and certainly a state that is not in a state of emergency. Montana did pass a law that did not have a federal carve-out. So, there's been a lot of things, and there's a lot of really, really important legal issues to address. But just like with the vaccine passport bill that I voted against last April, I voted against that because it would allow a healthcare facility to deny services based on vaccination status. And this is what we're seeing where, so-and-so has been waiting for an organ transplant for 10 years or however long. Someone's been waiting for an organ transplant, and then they're denied because they don't have a COVID-19 vaccine. That's what really I want to stop. I want to stop that discrimination. I don't want to allow any legal avenue in code for a healthcare facility to deny someone services based on a vaccine status. The way that Amendment H8187 was written, it would allow that. It would allow a health insurance company to cut someone off based on vaccination status. It would allow a health insurance company to impose a surcharge, not just on the person, but their dependents as well. So this is where you have insurance companies that seemingly want the legal right to impose a financial disincentive on someone in order to coerce a child to get a vaccine against a disease that they might not really even be at risk at. So those were not powers that I was comfortable to give to these big special interests. I think it's very upsetting to me that when we write laws based on what the insurance companies tell us, that's not a good way to write law. We need to write laws to protect Iowans. There is a way to have a perfect medical freedom bill. That would be enshrine the concept of religious liberty with a strict scrutiny standard, exactly how it exists at the federal level now. And that would give people a lot more legal protection in their sincerely held beliefs, to keep those intact in public accommodation at their place of employment. So there's a lot of really, really important things. We haven't even talked about injury or safety yet and all those other issues that are related to this. So there's a lot to go into, but it really, really makes me uncomfortable when they want to put in law and say, hey, this is unfair discrimination, except when the federal government says so, or except when the hospital says so, or except when the health insurance company says so. And it was, I asked, I said, hey, does this allow the imposition of a surcharge? And you'll get different answers. And so when I'm asking a simple, straightforward question and lawmakers are giving me different answers, that means the language is ambiguous, and I'm going to vote against the bill because I want Iowans to have laws that they can clearly read, understand, and can be easily applied. And the legislature is not giving you guys that. So I'm not going to vote for a bill unless I am very, very sure that it's going to protect the freedom of the people of Iowa at all times.
Thank you both, and thank you for helping to have Iowa be, in my sense, towards the top of this list in honoring medical freedom.
Yeah, we're top tier. We're top 5.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And I do want to mention here, we have time for probably just 1 or 2 more questions. Go ahead.
Okay, mine kind of banks on the last question. I'm Sarah Ledger. I'm a physician here in Southeast Iowa, and I grew up in Fairfield. And just to talk about part of your medical freedom bill, the bill seeks to end vaccine requirements in public schools, and these requirements exist for critical public health disease prevention. Vaccines have prevented many horrible deaths and comorbidities due to pertussis, measles, polio, tetanus, diphtheria, and many more. Many of us have not had to endure watching a loved one suffer from one of these diseases thanks to vaccine requirements. Why would we want to move a well-established public health gain backwards due to a sudden controversy over a new vaccine? Right now, COVID vaccines are not required in the schools at this time. It's not really an issue in the schools at this time, so why are we addressing all vaccines in the schools right now that are well-established? And then speaking of medical freedom, I have patients that are immunodeficient, meaning that vaccines don't work for them. So what about their rights and their freedoms and their right to be safe when they go out in public? Thank you.
So thank you, Sarah, for that question. As far as I know at the State House, there is no proposal to affect the childhood immunization schedule. The exemptions for those have been in place. I have seen a lot of polling where the number of parents who are wishing to do an alternate schedule is increasing. I think just with the way the medical establishment has approached the issues of the last couple years, there's a lot less trust. In terms of communicable disease, one, for what you said at the end about someone's right to be protected, the important question, and I asked this to the Judiciary Committee, I was saying this last year, long before Dr. Fauci admitted it on television, that the current mRNA shot, it was very unclear how it would affect the transmission of an illness. And just the way that injected biologic was designed, that it could lead, if the mRNA spike protein was working properly, you could have an instance of someone who is infected but not feeling as symptomatic, and therefore really being much more of an asymptomatic super spreader. That was a possibility, just the way that the mRNA technology did not prevent the infection of an illness. And as Dr. Fauci even told us, with many of the variants of coronavirus, the presence of the virus in a vaccinated or unvaccinated person was identical, that there really was not much of a distinction in the person's ability to transmit the virus. Similarly, with the current pharmaceutical product, it was very unclear the length of time in which that any semblance of protection would endure. So someone vaccinated 2 months ago could potentially be a very different risk for contracting or transmitting a serious illness than maybe 4 or 5 months. And so there was just a lot of unanswered questions. And so the premise of your question that people deserve protection, absolutely. And I think that's why we need to be doing everything we can to, every single person has a responsibility to have a functioning immune system to ensure that they do not transmit illness to others. But if you're going to say, I'm going to protect people by making everyone else get vaccinated, one, that's very unfair and is going to violate people's freedom. And two, it's not going to work very well. And that's why the Omicron variant, despite everything we've seen, just completely ripped through the entire nation. And I think that's what ultimately led to the demise of the COVID regime, is because so many people got sick, vaccinated or otherwise, that these things just weren't working the way they were advertised. So obviously, I really appreciate the question. I think every single individual has a responsibility to create a safe and welcoming and harmonious environment for all other people, and the environment included. But does this medical intervention accomplish that? And if it doesn't, why not? And if it doesn't, and then how do we know? And that's the thing. For the people are like, oh, Jeff, how did you know? How did you know that the shot didn't prevent infection and transmission? How were you able to say that 5 months before Dr. Fauci? It's because I read the FDA approval document. And I knew exactly what was evaluated in that trial. So I could say with a degree of confidence that this has not been formally evaluated on its ability to affect infection or transmission. So when we're talking about public health, the transmission of disease has to really be, the FDA should have evaluated that. And if they would have had that data very transparently given, we could have had probably a lot more voluntary compliance with these health measures. But even unfortunately, at the national level, the FDA and the CDC were not disclosing all the data. They had all the data they needed to break down hospitalization status by age, sex, vaccination status. they decided not to release that because they didn't want the public interpreting that data in a way which contradicted their narrative. So the more the health agencies can be transparent, the more that we, the people, can read the FDA approval documents so we have a real clear idea on what the product does and doesn't do, I think that'll lead to a lot better policy.
So that wasn't really my question, though, about the COVID vaccine. I was more talking about why are we taking a step back looking at all vaccines?
So I think the people who have been looking at that is they feel so betrayed by the medical establishment, and then also the necessity of the schedule. So I think the childhood schedule, you're looking at somewhere like 69 or 72 doses by the time, if you include the flu shot in there, you're getting up to 70 doses by the time a kid is in their teens. So a lot of parents are questioning, is that maybe, do you really need, 3 doses of MMR? I know in this community, we hear a lot more about the injuries associated with these things.
We don't give 3 doses of MMR.
We'll look at the schedule. So anyway, the schedule's expanded. When you look at the schedule that's used in the United States, it's different than used in other countries. So I think there is some room for debate and discussion on, our vaccine schedule versus other vaccine schedules, and making sure that each parent has the choice. And again, as long as we have proper nutrition, sanitation, I think there are a lot of ways to address illness. I think vaccine could be one tool, but I'm not of the opinion that the vaccine industry is the end-all, be-all to preventing disease.
Thank you. And Joe, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I would just like to add, Sarah, thanks for your question. The current proposal, we had this last week, did not deal with these vaccinations for children and being required to go to school and those sorts of things. It was strictly with the COVID variants that they would be dealing with.
That was the one that you guys have on your...
I think 24, 25 might have
Yeah.
been a little bit more expansive.
Yeah, 24, 25 is what I was...
Okay, yeah, the amendment that we had on to the tort reform bill this last week that we actually voted on, that one would only have dealt with COVID-19 variants and it wouldn't have dealt with the schedule that you're talking about for children to go to school.
Okay.
Well, and then the specific issue we're trying to solve is the unfair discrimination that results as someone making a different medical choice. And so at least for those other childhood vaccines, we're not seeing any instances of discrimination, at least as far as I know. So I think that's maybe why we haven't talked about that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Sarah, for your question. And sadly, it is 9 o'clock, so we do have to end the session. But I do want to once again thank our legislators for coming and talking with us today. And then once again, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors of the event, the Fairfield Arts and Convention Center, Freeman Cavanides Law Firm, Livewire Electric, Jefferson County Farmers and Neighbors, and the Sierra Club of Southeast Iowa. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you here on April 30th for our last session at 7:30 a.m. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.